each of these factors individually is the source of major constraints on the ability of the EU and the member states to address conflicts and crises. But when they combine with one another, and they have combined, the effect is indeed seriously constraining. Even in the best case scenario, at least the best case scenario as we see it, of an EU which is capable of undergoing an ambitious set of reforms. We're not talking here about federalization, absolutely not. It's really, we really build this scenario of reform by taking existing trends in the public opinion and coming out with potential institutional solutions that we deem as plausible. So you will not find anything related to a common European army or something like that. But precisely because of that, even in this best case scenario, a reform EU would not be geopolitical in the traditional sense of the term, that the EU would become a great power among great powers. The EU, for as long as it remains, which in my opinion is forever, a supranational intergovernmental hybrid, will never be able, and it's not a bad thing in my opinion personally, to act like a great power, but it will have gained the necessary assets to protect itself, to reduce its dependence and vulnerability to the geopolitical games of other powers, and therefore to navigate great power rivalry better than it is capable today. And therefore, reform is the only scenario in which the EU can be a first-rate international security player.
If you look at it from the outside in, then it's like catastrophe. Yeah, I mean, we may be geopolitically awake, but there's a war on the European continent, and we're not doing that well, frankly speaking. There is a war in the Middle East, and we are just, and that's just ultimate catastrophe. Like, we're nowhere to be seen. You know, we're divided. We're just, you know, not even taken into even the remotest of considerations. We have levers that we choose not to use. You then say, okay, fine, I don't look east, I don't look south, I'll look west. Oh, disaster, disaster. What's going to happen if Trump returns to the White House? So all of these things are happening outside. It's context, yeah? And so you look at it from outside in, and that's what makes you despair, because, you know, although you may be patting yourself on the back, the context has changed so dramatically that the progress that you have made, and I think this is why, in a sense, you know, Riccardo was saying, well, you know, if we continue as is, then it's just going to be from one catastrophe to the next. So even to remain at the level in terms of influence that the EU is at, it has to fundamentally transform. And the reason why, I mean, you know, to say that reform's a good thing is, again, almost tautological, but it becomes a particular necessity because that change in the outside context is so dramatic that simply remaining as is will simply mean that you will just continue going downhill.
I would say that we should stop being sort of too critical of the EU as an international actor when it's not always the primary job of the EU to respond quickly, but to respond properly. And with the exception of Gaza, which is a total disaster, and the EU will never be able to find a consensus on it, and every time they talk about it, it makes things worse. Actually, I think Ukraine has shown that the EU foreign policy is in pretty decent shape, and given time, it can create levers, initiatives and policies that make it more crisis-proof for the next one.
The question is the EU really also learning all the lessons that it is learning across along the way? For example, on Ukraine, has the EU really understood that it is a war that is a long war and has kind of learned to prepare for that, which we've seen now in 2013? It is clear that this is going to continue. Is the EU really sort of changing perspectives there? I think that's something where we have to see, has the EU learned the lessons from the Sahel, for example, from the huge failure that it really sort of its foreign policy there has been, which has not necessarily all been the EU's fault, but what lessons can the EU learn from that? And I think there is still a lot that can be done there. So it's a trajectory, I guess, where we can see some changes. But I think a very, very important point that is for the EU to kind of take more into consideration, and as we were talking about the contestation of EU foreign policy, is the contestation from the global south. So the so-called global south countries across Africa, Asia, Middle East, Latin America, where the EU and its double standards are sort of ever more striking.
I think there is clearly a strategic awakening. There's great self-confidence, I think, coming out of this experience because we acted fast, we acted in a robust way, we did things we never thought can happen. We actually had impact on the ground, particularly at the beginning. But of course, the obvious question that comes out today is, can we sustain this? Will this be enough to deliver what we want to see, which is Ukraine defend itself against Russia? This is the ultimate test. So this is a question that will be answered only by time. Your question, will this be a lasting wake-up call? Only time will tell us. But I think it was a wake-up call. There is a lot of self-confidence, and also I think what has changed a lot is that the conversation about security, about defense, about a world that has changed is now at the center not only of the strategic community in Europe, but also of wider public.